Welcome to the Commemorative Air Force webinar series. We are so excited today to tell the inside story of FIFI, our B-29 Superfortress. We have three expert panelists with us. John Agather and Niels Agather are the sons of CAF member number 239, Vic Agather. Of course, Brad Pilgrim, CAF board member, has a long and intimate relationship with FIFI's restoration and the history of the CAF. In fact, Brad really knows where the bodies are buried. John, would you briefly introduce yourself to us?
Sure. I'm John Agather, so son of Vic and Fifi Agather, and I'm a former chairman of the American Air Power Heritage Museum for the CAF, former vice chair of the foundation, and a former chairman of the board of the Reno Air Races.
Excellent. Thanks for being here. Niels.
So I'm Niels. I'm John's older brother. I'm not a former, I'm a current. So I'm a current member of the general staff, and I'm chair of the foundation and chair of the museum currently, and former unit leader, B-29 Squadron.
Thanks, Niels. And Brad?
And I'm Brad Pilgrim. I'm essentially nobody in this. I just am somebody who started liking B-29s and FIFI in particular as a young kid. And I'm on the Flying Museum board now. And several years I was a flight engineer on FIFI, and I'm currently the assistant director of maintenance at the Kavanaugh Flight Museum.
Excellent. Nice to have you guys here. I'm Nancy McGee. I'm the VP of Education for the Commemorative Air Force, and got to draw the short straw, which in this case is really good, to talk to you guys and be the moderator for our event. So on August the 3rd, 1971, the B-29 Superfortress FIFI arrived at CAF headquarters in Harlingen. Today we're here to learn a brief history of the B-29 and of course the story of how the CAF came to own one. Brad, you really know the history of B-29s. Would you go ahead and start telling us about that?
The B-29 came about as a request from the Army Air Corps for a long-range, very heavy bomber, as they carried it, as they called it. They wanted an airplane that could carry 20,000 pounds of bombs, at least 2,000 miles at a speed of 400 miles an hour. And the B-29 essentially met all those requirements. And it went through a lot of teething troubles. It was really pushed into development because it was had so much promise for being able to destroy the Japanese ability to fight the war. And it was really pushed into development before the engines were really developed completely. The airplane essentially stayed the same from the very first one to the very last one, airframe wise. Most of the changes mechanically involved the engine and everything because they just were not ready when they were pushed into production. And you can see on this slide here, the first flight September 21st of 1942, and then in February of 43, the second prototype to fly crashed, and it was not an engine fire as people say. It did have an engine fire that they had put out, but another fire started in some test equipment, which blew the leading edge of the wing off and caused the airplane to crash. But because of this, when this crash happened, there was already 1,600 B-29s had been ordered and paid for by the Army, and 250 were on the production line at the time. And so the airplane was going to continue to be forced into service, and basically the engine problems were never really overcome completely. They got better, but it was never really ironed out until the advent of the jet. The engine that's on the airplane ended up being okay, and later developments of the engine, the 3350, were good engines, but the initial B-29 engine just never did work out the way they wanted it to.
I'll add to that the B-29 is really the master mind of Hap Arnold, because as England went into the war in 1939, he told President Roosevelt he was convinced that England was going to lose, and that we were going to need a long-range bomber that could take off from the east coast of the United States, go into the heart of Germany and back, because we weren't going to have any lifelines in Europe to be able to land in. So Hap Arnold had flown in the Douglas World Cruisers in 1924, along with a guy named Eric Nelson, which is who my father was assigned to when he was drafted into the Army Air Corps in 1940. And the reason that Hap Arnold chose Eric was to head up the B-29 program was because they went all the way back together to 1924 in the Douglas World Cruiser's flight. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, that's how it started.
Yeah,
Now, the B-29, go ahead, Niels.
Just one thing I would add about Eric Nelson, besides being a very good pilot, he was an engineer and a bit of a mechanic, and that's part of the reason why his airplane made it around intact around the world, the world cruisers. The other thing is that Eric Nelson had not volunteered. He was working for Boeing as a test pilot for Bill Boeing specifically, and so it's very knowledgeable. First off, of Boeing as if you will, as the chairman of the company, but also the company itself, and very familiar with their process, which made it easier for him to be in charge of the B-29 program or be heavily involved in it.
The B-29 was being designated, or excuse me, it was being designed at the same time that the production lines were being built. And this was all before there was a flying aircraft. The US needed a long-range bomber urgently, and so they took some shortcuts to get to it. And I think when we look at this slide of the Battle of Kansas, this is about the time that your dad, Vic Agather, became involved in the B-29. So can you talk about this?
So you go ahead and talk about how he got in.
He was involved from, honestly, 1940, from the very beginning. So Battle of Kansas came along, 2.5, 3 years later. For starters, but yes, my father was there in the winter of 43, 44, and what was happening there is airplanes were coming off the assembly line and going down there to be staged. The parts and pieces for modifying the airplanes were arriving because what would happen is the airplanes were not stopped in production. They're rolling down the assembly line, and if a modification needed to be made, and it could be made on the assembly line, it was made on the assembly line. If it was too far down the assembly line to make a modification, a kit was produced for it and sent to Kansas so that it could be modified in the field, in essence. And then on top of that, the crews were coming in, and the crews very often had not seen each other. So they were being assembled there to make teams of each crew for each airplane. Most of them had not seen an airplane. Maybe the pilots, a few of them had been checked out, but others had not. Engineers were coming from other places, maybe coming in from Europe or other places to form up with B-29s, and all this taking place over that winter. And as you can imagine, the kits showed up, and they weren't in any particular order that anybody could make sense out of. The airplanes showed up. Very often they didn't say, well, it needs, kit 1, 2, and 3. It took someone like my father who knew based on the serial number, he knew kind of when it was produced, serial number and date and so on. When it was produced, he would know, well, it needs this kit and this kit and this kit. And so that's what he did, along with many other people.
Well, and what happened to him there, and it's kind of a famous story that has been covered in several publications. So he went 5 days without sleeping, putting together these kits for each airplane, as they were going to go to Kharagpur, India. That's the first place they were going to be stationed. And each airplane had to have a kit that went with it because they didn't have parts in India for these airplanes, and each one was different. So my mom would talk about how he didn't sleep for 5 days, and they suspect he had a heart attack in the middle of it. They're not really quite sure, but because of lack of sleep and just being so stressed to get these airplanes ready to go to India, at one point some general came in, and my dad was in the cockpit of one of these airplanes. And a sergeant came up and he said, Captain Agather, there's this general out here who wants you to form the troops up to review the troops. And my dad said, he looked out the window and he could tell that this guy was a swagger stick general with his perfectly pressed, uniform. And the response my dad gave was, tell the general I'm a little bit busy right now, but if he wants to come up here and give me a hand, I could really use some help. Well, when my dad went to go see his commanding officer, Eric Nelson, that afternoon, he said, hey, let me ask you about this general, because you're being put up for court-martial. And my dad hadn't even really thought twice about it. He was just so focused on the mission. And I think he was actually, at this point, he was already a major. And so the general had asked for my dad to be court-martialed. At that point, Eric Nelson called Hap Arnold directly and said, listen, I don't know who this guy is, but we're busy trying to get your bombers to India. And this guy is trying to put up one of my guys for a court-martial. And that afternoon, Hap Arnold made the B-29 team civilians. But they were civilians, and that they only reported to him directly. They were that critical. So there's a group of about maybe 6 or 7 Nelson's Bird Dogs that were all made civilians that afternoon. And then my dad had to go back in after the war and say, listen, I deserve promotions that I didn't get during the war because I was a civilian during that whole time. And it was one of the reasons why literally right after VJ Day, he was able to catch a transport back to the States before anybody else, because it usually took months to get cycled back into the States. And in his case, it was a matter of days.
And the general ended up going to Thule.
Thule, Greenland.
Yeah.
Cool off.
The swagger stick got sent off. That was the end of that.
Yeah.
Well, in the interest of time, we're going to skip over the B-29 service in China and India and go on to the Mariana Islands. So Brad, I'm going to ask you to jump in here and continue with the history of the B-29.
As Niels and John were saying, the B-29s initially went to India. The problem with that was they were having to go into China in order to reach targets in Japan. They couldn't carry enough ammunition to really, or enough weapons to really be effective. So when we captured the Mariana Islands in the Pacific, all the B-29 operations were moved there, and that put them within about 1,400 miles of mainland Japan. And Tinian, Saipan, Guam, those were the primary bases that we used. And that's where they started launching the Tokyo fire raids and all the raids over Japan that were really effective towards the end of the war and bringing the war to a close were all launched from the Marianas. And this where me and Vic and John and Niels all had something in common, is that their dad was on Saipan during World War II, and my grandfather invaded Saipan during World War II. So, and I've been there several times with the military. So, obviously the atomic bomb on August 6, 1945, which was in Hiroshima, and then the second one 3 days later in Nagasaki, they were launched from Tinian Island. And it didn't solely bring the war to an end, but it certainly hastened it a lot more than most people want to give the credit for it nowadays. In revisionist history times, the atomic bomb really did push it over. And the Japanese, I don't remember, it was the prime minister or one of them, some high Japanese officials said that the biggest reason for the Japanese surrendering was the appearance of the B-29 over Tokyo. He didn't particularly say fire raids or atomic bombs. He said just the fact that the B-29 had appeared, that brought the war to an end. So, but the B-29, that didn't end its military career. It went on to Korea, and then during the Korean War, it really was the primary heavy bomber that we had. The problem came to light that they were doing daylight raids like they had tried during World War II in Europe, and in one day they lost 28 B-29s to enemy fighters. The B-29 during World War II had operated at such altitudes, or was capable of such altitudes, that the fighters couldn't really get to it. By now, the Chinese and the Koreans had the MiGs, the jet fighters, and so the B-29s weren't untouchable anymore. And so they reverted to being a night bomber airplane, and then as soon as the jets came along, the B-29 was pretty much phased out and went on to being a test airplane. Of course, everybody knows the X-1 and all that were dropped from the B-29. They were also dropped from the B-50, which was a later development. But Chuck Yeager's, first flight to break the sound barrier, the X-1 was dropped from a B-29.
I'll add to that the B-29, there's a lot of firsts in that airplane. So it's the first mass scale production pressurized airplane in the world. It was known as a shirt sleeves bomber versus the B-17 B-24s, where those guys at altitude had to wear these leather fleece-lined electric heated suits because it was getting down to 20, 30 below in the cockpit. The B-29 was really a Cadillac because you were flying in this pressure vessel. It's also the first airplane that had a very rudimentary, but it did have a computer system on board for trajectory. And really, the Boeing company considers the B-29 the first airframe that allowed them to go on to do commercial aviation in large scale after the war in a meaningful way, because they learned so many production firsts making the B-29 versus the B-17.
Thank you. You know, in the mid to late 60s, the CAF wanted to add World War II bombers to the collection. So, John, Niels, how did your dad become involved with the CAF and this mission to get World War II bombers?
You want to take that one, Niels?
Yeah, through friends, friends who had connections in the valley, who had other friends in the valley. My dad became aware, our dad became aware of the CAF and joined, I'd say early on. He said serial 239. I thought it was 212, but anyway, low 200s. And the mandate that they were after was to have a complete collection of all, I think it was initially American aircraft. And then it went from there to sort of Allied aircraft. And then, of course, they picked up foreign aircraft as well, enemy aircraft. But in my dad's case, he didn't feel like you could have a complete collection unless you had a B-29. And B-17s were, I mean, I won't say they were real common, but they were out there to be had. And we, you know, CF quickly picked up a couple of them, the ones that we currently have. But B-29s were, you know, not available anywhere really. If you wanted to, it's amazing really that in such a short period of time, the last flight, it was, I don't know, Brad can correct me, it was 59 or something like that. And yet you couldn't, even today, I mean, if you want to go look at a B-29 or a B-24, I mean, think of B-24 with 18,000 plus made. I mean, if you want to go see one, there just aren't very many, just to physically lay your eyes on them. And so the same thing was true with B-29s. And I don't know how much detail you want to go into, but, you know, they went and looked at the ones at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland. Turns out, I mean, today you might want to restore one because people do amazing things with derelict aircraft. And just by luck, they found the ones in, you know, in China Lake. And out of that came.
Let's talk about that. So the intention was to find an aircraft that could be restored to flight-worthy status. So go ahead and share with us the journey to find the right B-29, because you mentioned Aberdeen and then China Lake.
The one in China Lake was found by a guy named Roger Baker, who is very critical on not only finding FIFI, but also in the first flight back to Harlingen. He was a pilot, I believe, with United, and it's a funny story because he's flying over a restricted airspace in his Cessna 210, I think is what it was, and he found the airplanes. And then he reached out to the Navy and had called my dad and said, look, I think there are these airplanes that the Navy has. And so he was able to gain access into China Lake and took a look at them and said, I think these are restorable. And then they, out of all the, I think there's 18 of them sitting there, they chose ship number 31, which ended up becoming FIFI. Part of it was because it had the best glass still left in it. But one of the things they had to do is, my dad had to have, when he agreed to pay for the restoration, one of the things they did was they had to go make the blister canopies in the back because there were none to be had.
Now, I would add the other challenge is, so Baker was not supposed to be there, right? Restricted airspace. He knew exactly what he found. There was no doubt. There was no thinking in a sense about it. He knew what he had found. However, these airplanes were not on any inventory anywhere. So the Navy said, well, no, they don't exist. You're wrong. You saw the wrong thing, et cetera, et cetera. And that caused further delays until, in fact, on, you know, who knows where in some drawer they found them. Obviously, found the inventory. I mean, got to have the paperwork. You lay your eyes on an airplane, but it doesn't exist till there's paperwork there to, you know, to identify it.
They
Brad,
were,
you and I talked about why these were in China Lake. So explain to our audience about that.
Yeah, the whole reason Neil's touched on how few B-29s there are around. The biggest reason that there are very few is they had no commercial use at the end of the war. B-17s did, B-25s, A-26s, even the B-24 to an extent had a commercial life. The B-29 didn't. It never had a commercial purpose. The reason the few that exist do is primarily because they were such an advanced airplane. They were able to be pressurized and all this. They sent them to China Lake and to Davis-Monthan and one or two other places, Aberdeen, Maryland, to be ground targets. Kind of like, you know, it's abhorrent to us today, the idea of blowing up an old airplane, but we do it all the time with F-16s and stuff like that that are drones. What they did with these B-29s is they would set them out on this range and they would pressurize them and they would shoot them with different style armament, different shaped warheads and projectiles. And they did it for two reasons. One, to test the weapons to see what kind of damage you could expect on an airplane with the weapon, but also to find what kind of things you needed to do to airplanes to make them more resilient. And the B-29 was perfect for this because it was able to be pressurized. And FIFI, as far as we can tell, October 1956 is when she went to China Lake. And I met a guy at an air show several years ago who had his logbook with him. He had been one of the scanners when they delivered the airplane to the boneyard there. And he told me when the CF got the airplane out of the boneyard, there were no records for it. There was absolutely nothing existing on it. This is kind of why the Navy and the Air Force claimed they had no B-29s. They had been listed as targets. And so all it said was at China Lake, they have 150 targets. Well, some of those were B-29s, some were Hellcats, you know, all these different things. But this guy who had been on the crew that took the airplane to the boneyard, he said, the reason you have no records, he said, every single piece of paper for that airplane, the record cards, the logbooks and everything, he said, when these airplanes were being blown up at China Lake, the paper was blowing all over the range. So the base commander ordered them to take all the paper out of the airplanes when they arrived and burn it all. That way it doesn't blow around the range. So that's actually what happened to FIFI's logbooks and paperwork. And so when we got the airplane, there's absolutely no record whatsoever of its military use beyond its assignment card. And over the years, we've had a few people who can prove they flew this very airplane. So I've been able to piece together a little more of the operational history, but the plane wound up in China Lake with the intention of being destroyed. And like John said, there was a group of them that were kind of in the middle that had the other wreckage pushed up around them. And that's kind of why they were kind of protected. It wasn't saved for any particular reason. They just hadn't gotten around to digging her out yet. And they narrowed the search down to 5 airframes. This is what Roger Baker told me. He said, then we narrowed it down to the final 3. And they tried to get records from the Air Force on these 3 airplanes. They had none. He said, FIFI is the one that had the most glass that wasn't busted. He said, we still had to replace a lot of it. He said, but that's the reason we chose that airplane. Those other 2 airplanes out of that 3, they all survive today. One's in Korea on display, and I can't remember where the other one is offhand. But those 3 airplanes.
One of them.
Say again?
Myrtle was one of them.
Yeah.
What? Tell us about Fertile Myrtle, because
Myrtle was already a civilian plane at this time. It had come out of it sold directly from the Navy to a scrap operation who was flying it, but they were going to scrap it when they got done with it. And that's when y'all's dad tried to buy the airplane. And then he got
Kermit Weeks owns that now.
Yeah, Kermit has.
That was a civilian aircraft, and that's why it was available.
Mm-hmm.
And we missed remember the CAF missed the option on it, and the money got lost. The option money evaporated. 100,000, I want to say, dollars.
Yeah, it was a check that your dad had sent to headquarters, and Jim Hill was the executive director at the time, and Jim had laid it in his desk and forgot about it. And so the money didn't get sent in. And so the airplane sold to the second buyer. Your dad lost the money, and then his money he'd put down as a deposit. But because he had established a relationship with those people that owned the airplane, he was later able to acquire all the spare parts that they had that didn't go with the sale. So FIFI did acquire all the spare parts for Fertile Myrtle. Well, I've got the letter from your dad to the CAF where he was not happy about them losing his check. It's pretty interesting.
He had there's a lot of friction with the general staff and the the paid staff of the CAF at the time, because there was really an undercurrent among the Lloyd and Lefties of this world that did not want a B-29 because they could not fathom the economic cost of running a B-29. And they said, we can operate several P-51s for the cost of one B-29.
Yeah.
And my dad told them, it will never cost the CAF a penny to have this airplane. I'll make sure of it.
Yeah.
Niels, John, your dad jumped through a lot of hoops to get a B-29 donated from the Navy, and it was for educational purposes, which included a no-fly clause. So would you talk about the challenges that he overcame to get this aircraft?
Well, I'm gonna let John take some.
Niels'
He
story
says,
differs.
I got the story. I think I'm pretty clear on the story, but I'll let him tell it.
Well, you go ahead and then I'll correct you.
Well, the story is, as I told you yesterday, is the airplane is allowed to leave China Lake. The Air Force wanted it dismantled. My dad convinced them that that was not the way to do it, that it couldn't be put back together, which was not true, but he knew that it would be very difficult to disassemble the aircraft and then put it back together and take it back into flight. Not only difficult, but expensive. So they allowed one flight out of there, and wherever it landed, that's where it would end. And luckily, it made it all the way to Harlingen without any trouble at all. None. Amazing. Smooth flight. And then there it was sitting on the ground for a period of time, long period of time, while this no-fly clause was removed. And wherever he went, the government basically saying no, 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 couldn't be done. I think it's no different than a VFW post that's got a big gun out in front of it. It's demilled. That their idea was, you can have this, but it has to be demilled effectively, and those not fly it. And he finally ended up in the office of Barry Goldwater. And I think, as I mentioned yesterday, typical of my dad, my guess is he didn't have any kind of an appointment. He just showed up. This is the guy, head of the Armed Services Committee. This is the guy that could maybe help him. And he waited and waited and waited until Barry Goldwater would see him. I'm talking about, all day kind of a thing. And then my dad told a story, and the two of them connected because Barry Goldwater, his history was the history that the CF was trying to preserve. Barry Goldwater was he was a small government guy. He didn't like bureaucracy. Very conservative in his political views. And so to him, this was just government trying to shut something down. And as my dad would describe, he got mad, and blue smoke came out of Barry Goldwater's ears, and with that he made a phone call, and it was done. My guess it wasn't quite that simple, but basically that guy did it for us effectively. John, correct me.
I have a different recollection of that a little bit, not too different from it, but number one is coming out of China Lake. So there is a movie of the thing taking off from China Lake, and Lloyd Nolan loved to tell the story that he got a hold of the guy that shot the movie, and Lloyd is the one who procured that film. And because that's amazing that you had the foresight to go out there to film the takeoff of the B-29. And he told Lloyd, he said, well, I wasn't there to film the takeoff. I was there to film the crash. That was, they were assuming that it wasn't going to be successful. And then while my father lived in Mexico, the story was never allowed to be told because he just didn't want it to get out. But Lefty was the navigator. He was in the right seat, telling Randy where to fly the airplane, and he got him lost. And they made a pretty deep incursion into Mexico, coming across to Texas before Lefty kind of figured it out. And they came back across the border into the States. My dad didn't want to complicate the difficulties of getting the flight clause removed by having that story being told.
And you had the air defense zone, the ADIZ zone, which I think still exists.
Yeah, it does.
So the Barry Goldwater side of it that I remember anyway, because I was there for part of this, is that in those days when the CAF was really small, and I think Brad probably knows the history of when this award was given, but my recollection, it's 1973. And they used to have an annual banquet in the CAF. And this, again, when there were like fewer than 300 members. And Barry Goldwater was invited to come be the keynote speaker at that banquet. I remember being there. I think Niels and my sister were there too, because my dad was getting a big award, the big award from the CAF for FIFI. And there's movies of this too, where my dad is getting the award. And Barry Goldwater flew in a Sabreliner, I remember that. And he was whisked into an office with my dad, with Lloyd, Lefty, and I forget who else. And they met for a couple of hours about the B-29. Now, I was still living in Mexico at the time, but I think my brother and my sister, who had come in from the East Coast from their schools, had to go back on that Sunday. And Barry Goldwater had left shortly after the dinner, got back in the Sabreliner. It was a U.S. Air Force Sabreliner. And the next day, I still remember this very clearly, in the old officers club, it was neat. I mean, really kind of an intimate little club at headquarters there in Harlingen. Lloyd Nolan came out with a starter pistol, and he got up on top of the bar and he held up the gun to the ceiling and did a shot that blew a part of the ceiling away, because he didn't realize that even though it was just a starter pistol, there was still stuff coming out of the barrel, and announced that Barry Goldwater just called and said the no-fly clause restriction is lifted. And so shortly thereafter, FIFI went into really a second very extensive restoration phase, where they removed all the armor plating, the barber chair came out, all kinds of stuff was removed out of the airplane to make it lighter, because my dad didn't want to tax the engines because he knew that they were finicky. And it was ready to fly and be certified in August of '74, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 74.
Let's backtrack for a little bit. First of all, who is going to fly an aircraft that is deemed not flight worthy out of China Lake all the way to Harlingen, and who was even qualified to fly a B-29 at that point?
There's only one guy, Randy Sohn. And the reason he was qualified was because he had the most recent C-97 time. That was why he was chosen. And I would say that, he's really one of the most unsung heroes in the whole B-29 story, because he's really critical to that airplane, not only from flying it out of the desert, but establishing the summer tour series, all kinds of other stuff. He was a great stick. I mean, he just died here a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah,
COVID.
Sadly, we just lost him to COVID. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So 6 hours, 38.
Lefty was the co-pilot, and he had been a B-29 pilot in World War II, is my recollection.
B-24 pilot.
Yeah, B-24 co-pilot. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, then let's jump into that massive restoration you guys were talking about. 4 years trying to get flight worthy status and remove the no fly clause. So really talk us through that.
Well, a lot of this was done with the knowledge that they might not ever get to fly the airplane. I mean, they after they got the approval to fly it again, they really went into high gear. But a lot of this work was done without knowing if they'd ever get to fly it again. And so they went through the engines that were on the airplane when it flew again the second time were the same engines it had when it left the desert, which incidentally were the same engines who had been on it since 1956. They did a lot of, like John said, they cleaned it out. They, according to the logbooks, I've got the logbook from the very first restoration, and they removed like 2,700 pounds of sand and dirt from the belly of the airplane, where it had just been sitting with the windows busted open and all that. They took a lot of the insulation and all this kind of stuff out, but at the same time, they were going back to China Lake and gathering up spare parts and bringing a lot of spare parts back. And Vic Agather had said he wanted to get enough spare parts that they could, if the airplane somehow had to belly land someday, there would be enough spares there to go ahead and rebuild it again. And which is why we've still got extra bomb bay doors and gear doors and all. that were acquired in 1971 through 74 for this very purpose. We still have them today. Fortunately, we've never needed them. Hopefully we never will. But they started putting the airplane together and took all the military equipment out because it was just heavy stuff. There's 2,200 pounds of the equipment for the weapon system, the little generators that run everything, all that was taken out. But they made the airplane really mechanically, it was in outstanding shape. It was as good a shape as it had ever been. And they painted it. A guy named Charlie Day from San Angelo sent his crew up to Harlingen, and they painted it. That's the old bomber hangar there in Harlingen in that picture. They painted the airplane and basically had it ready. And this is what it looked like. October 10th of 74 is the day that they did the first flight after the restoration. You can see there's no markings on the airplane. Right after this, the stars and bars were put on, but it didn't have the large A on the tail fin or the nose art or any of that yet. It was just kind of listed as a standard run-of-the-mill B-29 at the time.
Well, and then the challenge of naming her. I mean, imagine naming an aircraft is no easy task at any time, but I can only imagine trying to name something that would have the visibility and the notoriety of this B-29. So how did the name FIFI come about?
The cruise, not my dad. He had wanted, you've got the picture of Thumper up there, and he had wanted Thumper. And but it was people like Bill Godwin, the people that had been restoring and working on the aircraft, those that had been flying it in that first early flight or two, who initially proposed it. And I guess as Brad told yesterday, really General Staff voted to have that done. And my dad was happy and proud, and I might add my mother was too.
I know that Niels and I were flown. We were both attending the same high school in Pennsylvania at the time. Yeah, I'm in this picture all the way over there to the right. That good-looking guy over there to the right. That's me. And he flew us from Philadelphia to Harlingen and didn't tell us a word for the 74 air show. And I remember we got into my sister's GTO, which Neil still has, and back in the days when you could drive out onto the tarmac, and as a surprise, did the high beams, and then that's where Niels and I saw for the first time that the airplane had been named FIFI. And the next day was the christening ceremony, where there's movies of that where my mom is breaking the bottle of champagne over the nose gear.
What did y'all's mother think of the name? Did she ever fly in the airplane?
She never flew in the airplane, but she and I've tried to find it since then, but the day after she died, and I was looking through her apartment, there was a note that she had written, like, to the world, saying that one of the things that she was most proud of in life was that the only flying B-29 was named after her. And it's not anything that she ever gave my dad any kind of credit for during the time that they were together. She'd always just kind of tolerated it or whatever, but I think secretly she loved it. She thought it was great.
Yep.
Now, FIFI the aircraft has been a movie star and been through a lot since 1974. So can you guys tell us between 74 and 2004 what FIFI was involved in?
Well, John kind of touched on it a minute ago. Randy Sohn he is the guy who started the touring business with old airplanes. And so what they were doing was they would take the airplane to like Minneapolis, and Vic said, do you think people would pay to come see the airplane? And Randy said, yeah. So they flew the airplane to Minneapolis, and that's when people started to come out and see the airplane. And that's where the tour industry that we do today, which still is how we survive, how all the other flying large warbirds survive. That was started by Randy Sohn and by the CAF. And quite honestly, I don't think we get enough credit for that sometimes, that we are the ones who started that industry. And then
I was on that tour. I was on the tour. We went from Harlingen to Marquette, Michigan in one hop, 8.5-hour flight to K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base. And then we went to Minneapolis, St. Paul. Actually, we landed in St. Paul, and then to Oshkosh that year. And that was the start of the warbird touring season that every major warbird follows today. And FIFI had a lot of firsts through all of that. Prior to the tour, there was so much pride in being a member of the B-29 crew. They were the first ones to really form their own squadron, very much opposed by the general staff at the time. The B-29 crew came up with their own hats that said B-29 on them. Man, I'm going to tell you what, everybody else in the CAF really hated the B-29 guys because they considered themselves the elitists. They were the first ones to have a patch made, a squadron patch that I remember anyway. They were also the first ones to create their own literature, the Blue Book, the famous B-29 Blue Book that we would sell on tour stops. So a lot of firsts for FIFI in the warbird community that is now standard for everybody.
Yeah, and the Blue Book was an attempt to make money, to sell something, which had not been done by anybody. It's amazing because today it's such a staple, the PX that every unit has. I remember various members putting up $5,000 each for the, whatever it was, $25,000 or $50,000 that it took to do the first printing of that Blue Book. And yeah, I forget how many printings, but it went through 3 or 4. I mean, it sold very well. I want to say $5 a piece, as I recall, is what we sold them for.
$10. I sold a boatload of those things. I mean, just to give you an idea of how popular the B-29 was then and still is. Coming out of Oshkosh, my dad was in the left seat, and I think it was Hall Bond who was in the right seat, and he was a Braniff pilot at the time. We ran into weather and had to put into some tiny little town in Wisconsin. Within an hour, there was a line of 5,000 people lined up to come see the airplane and do a tour. Hall had to leave. I ended up taking the right seat. I was 18, but qualified. And that was 1978. So that's the beginning of the tour season. And it just goes to show you that there was all this pent up demand, not only to see the airplane, but to buy all the swag that went with it.
And that picture out there, that's Paul Tibbets. He was he's the guy who flew the Enola Gay that dropped the first atomic bomb. And Paul Tibbets was just a normal squadron member. He requalified in the airplane. Randy Sohn gave him his check ride. Paul was a regular tour pilot. He flew the airplane just like anybody else did. And it's weird when I look through old squadron records and stuff where I have like his address and phone number, which today would be closely guarded because he's a celebrity. It's just listed along with everybody else in the squadron in alphabetical order, But
and if you didn't know who he was, which most people coming on tour, they didn't know who he was. And he was just a regular guy giving cockpit tours and just like anybody else.
And that's why I was told Nancy yesterday that for years and years, we were able to say FIFI was the world's only flying B-29. Well, later in years, when another one started flying, we had to start saying the world's most famous flying B-29. And I believe that, and it will always be that way, but I also nearly believe that she is the world's most famous B-29. Even though the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb, I was telling Nancy yesterday, most people know that, but they don't know the Enola Gay was a B-29. And if you look at the number of years the Enola Gay has been on display, which has not been very many, and the amount of people who go through there have been more people have seen FIFI in the last 40 years than have seen the Enola Gay. And so I do believe it is the most famous B-29 in existence. I do believe that.
And I think Paul would have agreed with that statement. And at the time that FIFI became flight operational and Paul got involved, he was really angry with the Smithsonian because the Enola Gay was just sitting out in the middle of a field at Andrews Air Force Base. I've talked to 2 different cab drivers, mind you, in Washington that said, oh yeah, I remember that airplane. I've got parts off of that airplane. I used to go steal off of them. So the Enola Gay got really kind of stripped. Whereas Boxcar, Hap Arnold, everything you see at the Air Force Museum that was World War II, Hap Arnold made sure that it went directly from war deployment to right field to the Air Force Museum. So I've actually been in Boxcar, and FIFI has tons of room in it. When you get up into the cockpit, it's commodious. You get up into the cockpit of Boxcar, a big fellow like me, it's a tough get around in that airplane. But Paul wanted my dad to help him restore the Enola Gay because he didn't think the Smithsonian was going to do it. And at one point, as crazy as it sounds, they were talking about putting the Enola Gay back into flight status and having a tour with FIFI.
I've got all the paperwork from that suggestion.
Wow. Well, I know there's been a number of questions that have come in advance about engines. So, gentlemen, let's talk about the challenges of the engines.
The B-29 engine was the Achilles heel from the beginning. It always was. It improved slightly through the course of the war. But if you look back in the old logbooks of FIFI, there was one year that we changed 11 engines in 1 year. And it just, some things just couldn't be designed out. And so in order to operate, keep in mind that all these years we weren't selling rides, really. We were just doing tour stops and air shows. In order to ever get, increase the business any at all, they knew that there would have to be a change with the engines, and the desire had been there, but the money never had been, I guess. And so what eventually happened is we ended up losing so many engines that we ran out of spares. And the people who build them weren't building. It wasn't totally their fault. Sometimes you're building old engines out of the same junk that the old engines were built out of to begin with. And so sometimes the parts are the problem. And then the knowledge level and the skill base to continue building these engines had deteriorated significantly. But you take an original B-29 engine and then the last version of the 3350 engine, other than nuts and bolts, there's nothing interchangeable between the two. I mean, they are completely different engines. The one on the B-29 was an extremely early engine that was developed as far as it could before they had to just build a totally new engine. And so that's the situation we wound up in, to where we just weren't able to continue operating with these engines that we had.
Yeah, and I would say that the people that were overhauling, I think we had 17 spares came out of China Lake, I think, 17 engines, plus the 4 that were on the airplane. And then we acquired more along the way. I don't think we ever bought one. Things were donated along the way. And then we would overhaul them. It's interesting. The ones that came out of cans seemed to last longer. In other words, the ones that had been built back in the day, so to speak. Whereas the ones we got overhauled, and it wasn't for lack of looking for good overhaul shops. You didn't know if you were going to get an hour or 5 hours or 100 hours out of these engines. They were just that bad. Part of it is the as Brad mentioned, the not very good original design, and then part of it is just the quality of overhauls that declined significantly. And as I mentioned, I was a finance officer at the time, and I knew we were going to burn up engines. And I would when I was figuring out, do we have enough money to go, I would count cash plus engines, because I knew we were going to use them. For a lot of places, you wouldn't think an engine would be like a current asset, but it was for us because we consumed them.
So Brad, this is about the time that you really got involved with FIFI.
Yeah, I in 2004, I went up to North Carolina and helped change an engine. They'd lost one up there, and I was in the Air Force at the time, and I went up and helped a friend of mine change the engine on the airplane. We got the airplane back home not long after that, to Midland at the time, and there was pretty significant corrosion. Gary Austin was the crew chief at the time, and he found a lot of corrosion that some we knew was there, some we just hadn't been able to take care of. And so Gary and a guy named Andy Bivens, who worked with him, did this, and a lot of volunteers did a massive, airframe overhaul, both outboard wing panels, nearly all the skin in the rear of the airplane, all the stringers, a lot of the metal in the airplane was replaced. And it came out of that little mini restoration really in perfect shape. We had all good engines on it, and they were still the old engines, but they were still good. And so they were getting ready to do one more tour before we ran into severe trouble with the engines again. So all that airframe work had been finished. Now the engines were broke. Now we didn't have the money to really do anything, but we were stuck until we found new engines, because we knew the old engines like that was no way to go forward. There was no way we could have done ride operations like we do today. There's no way we could have done it with the old engines. They just would not have taken that many turnarounds in a day. There's no way we could have done it. That's one of the old engines right before we took it off. That's number 4, right before we took it off for the last time.
About that time is when Niels volunteered me to be in charge of the re-engine project, much like he volunteered me to be on this webinar today. He's very good at volunteering my time. I got involved with just the project management of re-engineering the airplane. The crew chief at the time was a guy named Dave Miller, lovely guy. He referred to me as Darth Vader, because I would call him literally every day. What are you doing today? And we worked through the process of making the changeover to the hybrid engine that we have now, which is a combination of a DC-7 engine with a Skyraider engine, without the turbo compound portion of it. And that's a little bit of, arcane stuff, but it effectively doubled our horsepower. So we run the engines at a much lower manifold pressure RPMs because it's got so much power that the props will go supersonic now, and you lose power when you do that. So we went from having these really notoriously fickle engines to an extremely stable platform. And when I was doing that project, one of the things that came up was a request from Rod Lewis, who owned Rare Bear in Reno. This was literally like 2 weeks before the race, and they needed an engine for Rare Bear and wanted to know if they could buy the first prototype that we hadn't even run it yet for FIFI. And so we sold our engine to Rare Bear. I looked at it as, boy, that's a great test platform for us, because they're going to be running balls out around the pylons, and we're going to find out if that engine is any good or not. And it turns out that it was not really tweaked for racing, but they loved the stability of the engine. So that's what we have now.
Excellent. You know, FIFI has had a lasting impact on people and honored so many. So we've got a few images I wanted to just share with you guys and have you say a few words about the people that are in these images mostly.
That was down in Florida about 7 or 8 years ago. That was all that was left of an original B-29 crew. They had gotten shot down over Japan. They'd all wound up in prison, survived, and came home from the war, all 11 of them. And those 5 were the last 5 that were left at the time. And they've all since passed away. I kept up with them after that, but they all came to take one more ride in the B-29. And this is Paul Tibbetts there in the center there. That's Dora Doherty and another lady. Her name escapes me at the minute. They were the first 2 women that Paul Tibbetts trained as B-29 pilots to prove that the airplane was a flyable, easy to fly airplane. Not to be rude, but it's so easy a woman could do it was kind of the idea that they had. And so Paul Tibbetts trained these 2 ladies to fly the B-29 and sent them around to training bases in the U.S. And these guys were horrified, and they saw 2 ladies get out of the airplane. Well, if they can do it, I can do it. And it essentially ended the fear of flying the B-29s. And you'll see in the next slide, Dora, she passed away just a few years ago, but this picture was about 7 or 8 years ago. She flew, I was engineering the airplane, and she sat across from me, and a very nice lady and a really cool lady, and had such a neat career with helicopters, testing helicopters after the war was over. She has several world records in helicopters, but she sat there and judged my engineering performance the entire time. She was a really neat lady. She was a fireball. She's unfortunately gone now, like so many others, but.
Well, I'm getting texts, and the other woman's name is Dee Dee Mormon.
Dee Dee Mormon, that's it. Dee Dee Mormon.
Right. Now this picture was in the slide deck that Leah sent me, and I just looked at those eyes and thought, what is this man thinking, and how many people is he honoring? So can any of you speak to this photo?
I don't know who that is. That's after the restoration though, because it has the radio rack in it and everything. I'm not sure who that is.
Well, I know we've got a lot of questions coming in from the audience.
Let me say something about the radios. That's, to me, is an amazing story in that I get a call from the Rockwell Museum, I want to say, Nebraska wanting to know if we would we like these radios operational. And of course, you know, you're never going to turn down a nice donation like that. And they wanted to install them and make them operational. So I said, just let me check. And I checked with, I think it was Rick Garvis was already on board with us, and he'd love to have them too. But the idea, but I told him, I said, you know, we're not going to be able, we don't have any radio people. We can't take care of them. And they said, well, don't worry, we'll see if we can get, you know, maybe volunteers will come out. And what I was really thinking was ham radio operators, who would love the opportunity to maybe become another type of crew member on the airplane, some other way of expanding our base. And I remember I was on like my first flight as co-pilot on the airplane, training or something, and you could hear it in the background. And they, you know, they were talking to people in Nebraska, and then they were talking to people in Boston, and then they were not talking to people in Australia with these radios. And so they're original World War II, not modified, not modernized, and that's what's in the aircraft today, and all donated.
Wow. Amazing.
No different than the gun sights and the bomb sights, which were not in the aircraft. And as we went around the country, these things would come out of people's barns and basements and attics, and that's how we have what we have on the aircraft today, all donated.
The Norden bomb site that is in there today was donated by Tennessee Ernie Ford, who was a B-29 bombardier during the war.
Right, but we have others. I mean, and this was like you hear stories that next to the atom bomb, that Norden bomb site was one of the greatest secrets we had, and yet people have them in their basements. I mean, it's amazing.
Well, I know we've got just a few more minutes left, and lots of questions have come in from the audience, so I think we've got time for maybe two. First, are there any more B-29 aircraft at China Lake? And if so, what kind of shape are they in? And is anything going to happen with them?
There are 3 partial B-29s. And when I say partial, I mean 2 of them were victims of weapons tests and are just pieces laying around. And there's 1 more that was partially destroyed that was towed into the China Lake Museum to possibly be restored someday. So there's parts of 3 out there that all together would make about 3/4 of an airplane. So if you ever fly another one today, it won't be one that comes out of China Lake.
Are there any other B-29s besides FIFI and Doc being returned to airworthy status?
Not at the moment. Kermit Weeks owns a B-29 that was a complete one that we showed earlier that would need a significant restoration, but it is a complete airplane that could be restored and reassembled and fly. But just based off of the cost of doing this and the market that you operate in today, unless just a well-heeled billionaire came along that wanted his own B-29, I don't think you'll ever see another one fly. I think you'll see FIFI continue to fly for another 50, 60, 70 years easily. So I'm not worried about us not having a flying B-29, but I don't think there will ever be any more.
I will say that Boeing was very interested in FIFI because it was a good test bed for their aircraft going forward, particularly the B-52. I mean, I remember probably in the early 2000s, I went with Ollie Crawford, another old-time CAF guy, on a Air Force Civic Leaders Tour to Nellis Air Force Base, where the base commander said, well, I think you guys will like knowing this. We just certified the half-life of a B-52. So that airplane will be operational with the U.S. Air Force for 100 years.
You know, I agonize over what we're not telling in this hour because there's so many stories I know you guys have to tell. We've got about 2 minutes left. Is there anything that you wanted to share with our audience today that's a burning desire that we didn't touch already?
I'll defer to John.
I will say the one thing that I mentioned this to Leah yesterday on the phone, that when I was in charge of the re-engine project, about halfway through that project, I was in Midland talking to Dave, the crew chief at the time, and the components of the engine, of the new engine, are spread out on the ground, and we're looking at everything, and it occurred to me right at that moment, I have the exact same job right now than my dad had during the war, because that was one of the projects he was given, was try to solve the engine fires that were plaguing B-29s during the time. I think the R3350-57 engine for the war had less than 100-hour service life on them, something like that. And so those, if you look at the propellers and they've got those big old paddles on them, that was one of the fixes that they were trying to do, as well as the cowling. So for me, it was kind of a whole circle that all of a sudden I had the same job, as weird as it was.
You never know. Well, Brad, John, Niels, it has been such an honor to spend this last hour with you. I have learned so much. I know our audience has as well. I know there's still lots of questions coming in that I'm sure we'll find a way to get answers to for the audience. And I'll just invite the audience to join us again at this same time next week on Wednesday, April the 29th at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time for Ellie Dana and Elaine Webb, who are going to tell the story of the WASP. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right, thank you.